Hi, everyone, and welcome back to The Right Ingredients, the podcast where we explore the key conversations driving the specialty ingredients industry with a focus on talent, recruitment, and leadership. I'm Charlie Packwood, and I'm joined once again by Bobby Westerman and Alex Gould. Today's episode is a big one, and in fact, a topic chosen by our network. We're talking about salary expectations. It's one of the most important and often most misunderstood elements in any recruitment process. Getting this wrong can derail the entire hiring journey, whether you're on the hiring side or the candidate side. So today, we're going to unpack the why, the how, and the what next when it comes to navigating salary. Let's set the scene. What do you guys think, both Bobby and Alex, what do you think salary expectations are still such a difficult topic for companies and candidates to approach openly? Who wants to kick us off?
You kick it off, Alex.
Okay, sure. So I think it really comes down to a mix of a few things: discomfort, fear, and the use of legacy norms within the organization. For candidates, there's a fear of pricing themselves out of an opportunity, or worse, undervaluing themselves. For companies, there's a concern about internal equity or being perceived as cheap if their offer doesn't really align with what the category normals are. It's also still one of those taboo topics we don't get to be really trained on going through school and earlier in our career. It's not something we talk about openly, which just perpetuates the awkwardness, right? What I find really interesting is that all this discomfort doesn't usually go away in the process. It just shows up later on if it's not addressed early in the onset of the process.
Absolutely. Well, like you said, that discomfort doesn't go away. If you leave it till the end and start negotiating, candidates find that discomforting. So I think it's a whole thing that is really vulnerable for both the client and company perspective and a candidate perspective throughout the whole process. Alex touched on some really key points there. And I think, of course, there is that, again, as he mentioned, internal equity issue. If somebody internally finds out that a hire is coming up for a higher salary than they're on, there can be friction. Companies hold back because they want to manage fairness and consistency among the teams. But also, I think sometimes companies, and in our case, we found salary still in discussion. So maybe the hiring manager is unsure whether this role is going to land with a really senior manager, a mid-level person, or, the compensation is part of a broader view on the role. So I think there's a reluctance to overpromise on certain salary expectations when companies sometimes just don't know themselves. They've not aligned properly internally. And then again, as Alex has mentioned, from a candidate perspective, really sometimes candidates look at the overall picture and compensation. We talked about it in a previous podcast. How are companies attracting and retaining top talent? I think sometimes there are additional benefits that is not just the salary. So there is that reluctance to discuss it. So they may want to go through the interview process and understand what else can the company offer them. Does it align with their values and the culture they want to work in before salary is brought up? So yeah, bit of vulnerability on both sides.
For sure, good points from you both there. I think what relates back to, and I know you guys are probably sick of me saying this word, but transparency at the start of the recruitment process. I hear a lot of candidates when the topic of salary is brought up, the normal response is, well, it's more about the opportunity. I want to make sure that the opportunity is great. And that's our job as well, to make sure that these things align, but it's also to make sure that these little aspects of salary, of relocation, of all of these little topics, they also add up as well. And I think making sure that you're transparent with the company that you're interviewing with, the recruitment company that you're working with, you have to be sort of honest and upfront about your salaries. Yes, we want to make sure that the role is a perfect fit for you, but at the same time, we've got to know about salary. And I think when it boils down to it, if the salary is X and you are maybe slightly below, slightly over, whatever it may be, at the end of the day, a lot of companies are thinking, I want the best person. The hiring manager especially is thinking, I want the best person for this position. I think maybe HR are a little bit more hardball in terms of trying to get somebody a little bit cheaper to be in lines with everything that they have going on, which is understandable. But the hiring manager, I believe, or hiring managers really want the best person for this position. So if you are slightly over the budget set out for this position, I mean, from my point of view as a recruiter managing that recruitment process, I wouldn't write that somebody off if they are slightly over. It's not my decision to make, it's the client's decision to make. But being transparent from the outset, you're not wasting anybody's time. And what I mean by wasting anybody's time, I also mean your own time. You're not going through a recruitment process and then to get all the way to the end to then find out they can't afford you for this position because the budget is absolutely capped at that amount. So being transparent up front, super, super crucial. Okay.
Yeah.
So,
and what do you think?
Well, no, go ahead,
Can I
Bobby.
ask, what do you think are the negatives to that lack of transparency as well, in terms of how candidates might feel about an organisation if they're not being transparent?
I think the negatives of not being transparent from the outset are pivotal to an entire recruitment process falling down. I mean, at the end of the day, if you are going into a recruitment process, chances are you're probably going to find out in the first interview what the salary on offer for this position is. And if you think, okay, I'll see if I can go through the interview process and then play hardball at the end and try and get them above that, you're wasting your time in most of the cases, and you're wasting the recruitment process in terms of the client. And it's going to leave a bad taste in that client's mouth, and it's going to leave a bad taste in your mouth because it's a lot of time wasted. Now, if you're working through a recruitment company, there's no harm in asking the question. If they say, let's just say, for example, the budget for this position is 200,000 US dollars, and I am the candidate and I am on 210,000 euros. The recruitment company should be able to say, there's a little bit of wiggle room. We could move up, but we're not going to be able to move much higher. So would you accept parity? These sort of things. But if you go, yep, I'm okay with 200, and then get to the end of the recruitment process and start demanding 210, it's not a good look for you. And I think that without that transparency up front, you're really going to hinder your chances of getting a new job. And you're going to hinder your chances of a reputation with potentially a reputable company that you're interviewing with, because they might not want to come back to you in the future because they can't trust you through the recruitment process. How are they going to trust you as an employee? I think that's the number one hinder, I would say, for not being transparent.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think it really creates a bit of an energy shift, doesn't it, when that happens, because that kind of lack of transparency really takes the role in the discussion from being exciting, really wanting to know about the responsibilities, to actually becoming about the money at the end of the day, when actually maybe a more simple upfront conversation is more respectful. It saves everyone's time and everybody's more aligned going through the process.
For sure. Alex, anything to add on Bobby's question there?
No, I think you're both absolutely right. I think that time is the most valuable currency that we have. And if we're not being transparent throughout the process, especially at the onset of it, there's no way to really come to terms if we're not in the same playing field, right? If we're talking at two different stages, two different levels, two different compensation packages is what we're thinking going into it, without having that open conversation and dialogue, it makes for a very uncomfortable, offer process. And I think if the client, the company, is using a recruitment firm, it's on them to ease that blow, to really get into a smooth cadence of conversation and having that open dialogue without causing any discomfort or friction between the candidate and the client. And by addressing these things early in the conversation is going to be paramount to a smooth cadence of process thereafter.
For sure.
Yeah.
Well, moving on from there, I mean, let's sort of think about when salary should be discussed. And I think if you're applying for a role through a recruitment company, or you've been headhunted for a position, chances are in that first call with that recruitment company, they're going to ask you what your salary is. And that information is going to be passed on to the client before you've even spoken to the company. So chances are you've already discussed that topic. Now, if you've been approached by a company directly and they're wanting to have a conversation with you about a role and you go through that, or you apply online, whatever it is, but you're doing everything directly, not through a recruitment company, when do you think is the best point to discuss salary? Because I know a lot of candidates at the first interview will say, well, I didn't feel comfortable discussing salary, because they don't want to have this black flag over them that they're only in it for the money. So a lot of candidates will shy away from having the conversation about salary in that first interview. But do you think candidates should be discussing right in that first interview what's the salary on offer for this position, and being transparent to what they're currently earning?
Yeah, I think just piggybacking off of what I just said in the last topic, ideally salary should come up in the very first conversation, right? At least as a range or a framework. It doesn't need to be the final offer, but both sides need to know whether or not they're in the same ballpark.
Uh-huh.
When compensation isn't addressed early, it leads to what we just mentioned, a lot of wasted time, a lot of misplaced effort, and a lot of unnecessary frustration on everyone's end. The
Uh-huh.
candidate gets invested, the hiring team pulls in stakeholders, and then everything unravels due to just some basic misalignment that could have been avoided by having early conversations around salary. What that does is the complete opposite. It builds trust, it creates transparency, and it ensures both sides are aligned before anyone on either side decides to invest their time and dive deeper into the process.
Yeah.
Have you ever experienced clients coming back to you as a recruiter? We'll go back into the recruitment side of things now. Have you ever experienced clients coming back to you and saying, we felt that they were a little bit too money driven because they brought up salary so quickly? I mean, have you experienced that? Because I personally have. And obviously that is the worry that a lot of candidates do have, is discussing salary too early. It can sort of affect their chances of getting the position.
Yes, it's happened, but I do think it's a misleading evaluation on the company's end, right?
Totally agree. Yeah, that's what I was getting to.
Nobody wants to take a step back financially in their career. Even if it's a great opportunity, that's a big thing to think about and to, evaluate with your family and your people who are close to you in making this decision. But at the end of the day, I think when we speak to candidates in the market that are applying for these roles, 9 times out of 10, compensation is one of the top 3 factors and motivating factors of why they're looking for a new position.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I agree with everything Alex has said there and your points, Charlie. And I think the risk is as well, if you don't bring it up in the first conversation, is we know the roles that we recruit for, or many of the positions our network or job seekers are going for, is for a step up or a step up in compensation, that these interviews are not a 1 or 2 round interview. There are 4, maybe at a push, although we don't like it, 5-stage interview process where you are meeting loads of different stakeholders. So if in that first interview you meet the key hiring manager or HR, that is one of your best opportunities to extract all that information, because as you go down the line in the interview process, you're meeting extra people that aren't involved in that salary decision. So if you wait till 3rd round and bring it up with, somebody that's not involved directly in this hire, or, is the CEO or VP of the role that again is not getting involved in salary, that could be a really difficult conversation to have if you are leaving it that long. So I think it's really hard to gauge then, the perfect time to bring it up, because every interview stage is different. But if you have a bit of that confidence, like Alex was saying, to bring it up in the first round, then you're not going to waste anyone's time. And I think it can be done in a way that is really respectful. It's not the first question that you ask, but also to caveat all of that, I think you as an individual need to be quite prepared in going into that interview, if that's a question you want to ask, for them to ask you questions back based on your expectations. So have done market research, understand the value you could add if you are asking for a certain expectation or range of salary. There's loads of sites out there now that you can get a gauge of what the market average is. And if they are bring questions back for you, you need to be prepared to back up what your expectations may be.
Yeah. Well said.
Curiosity, Alex. I mean, this is quite a specialist question, and it's something that I found out the hard way very early on, who heads up all of our US operations. I understand that in some US states, it's illegal for employees or recruitment companies to ask job applicants about their previous salary history. Have you ever come across that, and how do you handle it?
Yes, mostly in California, it's illegal to directly ask how much a candidate is making. So the framework of that question, in the way that I narrate it, is something to the extent of, where does an opportunity need to be in order for it to make sense to you and your family to accept a new position? That opens the doors up not to what they're currently making, but so while I'm working with this candidate, of only bringing them opportunities that make sense for them.
Yeah.
Right? We don't want to bring something that's too far under their current benchmark. We would like to bring them opportunities that level them up from a salary perspective. But you're right. I think there's certain states right now and countries right now that do mandate full transparency in what the job offer is, to make things a little bit more parallel and even playing field. It
Mhm.
does get a little when we're recruiting for roles, nationally or internationally, when we're working with candidates that come from, do tell states. So it does make it fairly, interesting and somewhat of a minefield when you're playing that game.
Yeah, for sure. All right, no, I appreciate your input on that one. So let's look at it from the hiring side. Now, we see it all the time. Companies have a great opportunity, but lose good candidates because there's a misalignment in expectations, either from the salary that's been set out from the start or the candidate's expectations of what is a good salary for that position. So with that in mind, what should clients, companies be doing before they even go to market to make sure they're set up for success when it comes to salary negotiations?
You want me to take it, Bobby?
Go for it.
Sure. So I think that a lot of the heavy lifting from a company perspective should be done before the role even hits job boards. Clients need to benchmark the role based on market, internal compensation structuring, and overall compensation philosophy within the organization. Is this a premium role where they want to attract top tier talent, or is this a role that's leaning towards someone earlier in their career, earlier in their journey, who can grow into this position? Those answers and those questions shape the range of the messaging of the job description and ultimately the candidate experience. But if a company isn't aligned internally on comp, it creates a mess during the offer stage at the end of the process.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's as simple as that, isn't it? Companies need to be prepared and aligned internally. And I think to touch on something additional is discuss internally their flexibility for negotiation. So if they have done all this market research, they understand exactly kind of the value, what this role is going to bring, what kind of level of seniority they're looking for, what that compensation should be. They need to consider the different potentials they're going to interview throughout that process, that what happens if the perfect person comes along and they are on a slightly higher basic salary than what they're offering. Offering a really high potential and strong candidate could save them in future recruitment costs or, future hiring, depending. So I think having everything aligned internally based on the specific salary and compensation, but also considering where they can be flexible too, really saves a lot of time and headache throughout the process also.
Out of curiosity, I mean, do you think companies should be transparent with candidates about their salary ranges? So, for example, do you think that clients should be telling candidates, so the salary range for this position is 100 to 150? Or do you think that they should just go straight in the middle and say it's 125?
Well, I think that they're putting themselves up against the wall when they give a range that's wide, that wide from
Yeah,
100
of
to
course.
150,000. That's a huge, huge gap.
Yeah.
Even a $20,000 gap, if they want to provide a range, they also need to be diligent in providing the reason and an explanation and the level of experience of what it takes to hit the top of that range. Because I know
Mhm.
more times than not, a candidate's going to see that range, look at the top end, and that would be the expectation of what
Yeah.
that role pays.
Yeah, agreed. I think ranges can be really tricky. I think it's the best way to really kind of assess a range of talent. But as Alex said, you provide that range to a candidate and they go straight to that top end. And that's what they're looking for. And they understand that. So I think especially when people are applying individually to roles, when they come through us and we are supporting the process, we align candidates a lot more strongly to the job description, to what the range is, what the expectations are. And we obviously take a little bit of that burden off in terms of that highest expectation. But I think that becomes a real difficulty when individuals are applying for a role directly.
Yeah. And coming back to my earlier question, I mean, we work in a very niche industry, especially within flavors and fragrances, which is one of our core areas. And when we're looking at how many flavor houses there are in the world and how many fragrance producers there are in the world, it is limited. So a lot of the types of positions that we would recruit for, our talent pool are going to be with direct competitors of the companies that we are supporting. So with that in mind, do you think companies are enough aware of what their competitors are paying for certain positions? And if not, how can they learn more?
50-50, really. I think I've spoken with some companies that are really aware. So when they're briefing me on a role, they will say, we cannot offer the salary the likes of XYZ can pay, but this is what we can offer. This is our compensation. This is the kind of talent we're looking for. And that usually means somebody that's maybe stepping into a growth role that has an opportunity to develop, because they cannot offer the same ranges. On the flip side, if you look at a top, the top five and competing against each other, I do not think that they have enough market insights because they are very consumed in terms of their current hiring processes, what they're doing. They've got probably benchmarks to hit internally and budgets to hit. So I think it really depends on the size of the company as well. But that's where we can come in, right? Using external partners, really working with people to support and gain insights into the market on what do these people earn? What is kind of the average salary for a flavorist, for a perfumer, for a sales director? And we can really give them that market data that informs them on offers going forward.
Yeah, I think that's why the interview process is so valuable, right? You get so much information, even if it's not from a candidate who you're going to be putting through process, but they are applying for a similar or a like role that you're interviewing for, right? Getting the information from them, getting the real-time market insights of what they're valuing this position at is, invaluable information.
Yeah.
Well, now let's flip it and look at it from the candidate side, because as I've said earlier on in this podcast, a lot of candidates I know have found it difficult to talk about salaries, especially if they're not sure what the role is worth in the market, or they're worried about pricing themselves too high or too low. So we've covered the fact that we believe that it's very important for candidates to discuss and clients to discuss current salaries and salary expectations right off the bat to avoid wasting time and elongating a process. So with that in mind, I mean, let's look at it from this point of view. If a candidate goes to a first round interview with a company and salary is not mentioned at all, how would you advise candidates to bring up that topic, and how detailed would you look at going into their current salaries and salary expectations?
Good question. I think I mentioned it before, but firstly, candidates need to be prepared for a flip side of that question to be asked. So if they're going to an interview process, initially they really want to show their skill set. They really want to kind of have a great conversation with the interview panel, whoever is involved, and then bring up at the end their questions. So I don't think it should be the first question they ask. They can really bring it back to the role, really sounds like this role aligns with me, aligns with my either career aspirations or what I have done, with the examples they've shared throughout the interview, but then be prepared to ask that question in terms of, just confidence in asking the question. I think if they beat around the bush too much, it's going to seem that they're awkward, they feel vulnerable, they don't feel confident in what they're able to earn, but they need to be able to ask, what are your thoughts on the compensation on a role like this? And they can beef that question out however they like. That's a roundabout way of answering your question, Charlie, but I think they need to be prepared, because if they come back and ask, well, what are you looking for? They need to know that they are happy to share their expectations based on market research, based on the experience that they have, not dodge the question, but to be able to give a confident answer back also. So that would be kind of my advice.
I also think they need to be ready for the response too, right? How they react to that, knowing that everything is going to be negotiable, right? What they're saying is probably the starting point. So let's not get deterred. Let's understand the full compensation package. What else is incorporated in the final offer? So there's a lot of things to consider, but how they react to that information is very telling. So to your point, not just be prepared with, proving your market value, be prepared for not hearing something that you really want to engage with.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I think from my point of view on it, in terms of sharing it up front, I think there's no sort of dancing around the topic. The earlier it's discussed, the better. I mean, if you're speaking, my advice would simply be, if you're speaking to direct line manager, I think you can get away in that first interview of maybe not talking salary. Especially if you've come from a recruiter, you should be safe in the mindset that recruitment company has already told that company what you're earning. So they already have a rough idea. There's no need to go into the details. If you're discussing it with direct line manager, hiring manager, whatever it is, it's a topic I believe that cannot be skated over if you're having that first round interview with HR. I think that's a key point. I think when you're speaking to hiring managers, focus on the role, focus on your background, focus on what value you can bring and what that role looks like. Then when you're speaking with HR, before or after, whatever it may be, that's a topic for HR. That would be my opinion on it. And that's the advice that I would give to candidates.
Yeah, that's good advice.
On a side topic there, I mean, obviously with an old adage of making sure that you can always focus higher and then get negotiated down. It's very hard to negotiate up. So how truthful do you think candidates are within our market about what their current salary is? Do you think that there are individuals out there? Well, there's definitely individuals out there. I've experienced it myself. But do you think there is a majority of individuals out there that are saying that their salary is slightly higher than it is, with the mindset that if they are negotiated down, they'd also be happy with it? Now, I'm not saying that that is a good thing to do, but how regularly have you guys come across that, if at all?
I think it's a strategy, right? It's not great to get off on the wrong foot. And if you're ever in a position where you need to prove what you're saying, you could be put in a really uncomfortable spotlight. So I always lead, be honest, but be prepared and understand that what you're currently paid now has nothing to do with what your future worth is. So there's two separate conversations that can come up in the same one.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
That's exactly that.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. There's definitely individuals that, inflate their salary or compensation a little bit. And I think you can tell that when we know what maybe the market average is for a specific role, or if we know what our client is offering as a strong compensation. But I think, as Alex said, you need to be able to prove that if it comes to it for whatever reason. And I think it's more about really aligning your expertise, your value you can add to the organization, all these things that is what is important when discussing your compensation and salary and negotiating, rather than what your past salary was.
I mean, from my perspective, you might get away with it if you're not going through a recruitment company. If you're working with a good recruitment company that is specialist within your niche, chances are they have spoken to similar people in the same company that you work in. And if their salaries are on average here and yours is significantly above, that's going to, for me personally, if I was looking at that, that would raise alarm bells. Why is this person more expensive than their peers that are holding similar roles within that company? Is the company overpaying this person? Do they have a background, a higher education than their peers? Have they been with the company longer and been able to negotiate a higher salary? I will look into all of these things. And if it still feels off for me, as I said, the red flags are up and I'm a little bit cautious about this person because that trust has been broken. And as soon as that trust has been broken between candidate, recruiter, candidate, client, whatever sort of the partnership is going on, it's very, very hard to get it back. Very, very hard to get it back. So the dark arts of recruitment, I'm not saying I agree with them whatsoever, but I think that they do happen, unfortunately.
Yeah, without a doubt.
Transparency matters at the end of the day. It's a small industry, as large as it is, but we always say it, we know what goes on in these organizations. They know what each other are doing. But I think it comes to a point where it's kind of strategic transparency, shall we say. Really, not underselling themselves. Because if they might be significantly underpaid within their company right now, and that is why they're wanting to leave. So they might feel a reluctance in sharing that information at the risk of being underpaid again in their next role, because that's they know they're worth more than that. But definitely a little bit different when we're representing somebody and we can support that in a different way. But I think when candidates are applying for things directly, I think they inflate it a little bit more because of that.
Yeah. And on that topic, I mean, what advice would you give to candidates to really be able to strike a balance between being maybe overconfident in their value, but staying realistic and open to negotiations when it comes down to a potential offer stage?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I hope people, take out of this what they will. But my advice is always be honest, be prepared, and know your market value. You don't have to disclose, exactly what you're currently making. if it makes you uncomfortable, but you should be able to articulate yourself and your expectations and be able to back them up with rationale. This is going to
Yeah.
be based on your skill set, the scope of the role, and what's fair in the market and fair for that company. I'll repeat what I said earlier, right? I always tell candidates that it's your salary history doesn't define your future worth. But at the same time, you've got to show that you've done your homework and that your expectations are grounded in reality.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great answer, Alex. And just kind of to piggyback off that a little bit, you know, as Alex said, they don't have to share their exact salary, but say, you know, I'm happy to share my expectations based on my experience, based on the value that I can add, market research. I'm targeting a range of X to Y. Does this align with your budget? Does this align what you have in mind for this position? And again, bring it back to them to kind of try and extract that information, because no one wants to waste each other's time. So you need to align if actually your expectations are in line with their budget, because that then puts it back to the client or the employer, what their thoughts are on that expectation that person's wanting.
Sure. So if we had to wrap it up, I mean, I think the key takeaways for me here are salary conversations really need to happen early. The sooner the better. Both candidates and clients really need to do their homework from the outset. What is a candidate worth? What is being offered for the position? What is the average pay for a certain role? These are all things that both clients and candidates really need to do their homework on. The key word, transparency, so key. Realism and communication are absolutely key to making it all work and all sort of fit into place. Did I miss anything? Any final comments from either you, Alex, Bobby?
I think being able to substantiate your worth is, a good piece of advice for candidates going into process.
Mm-hmm.
Being able to understand and articulate exactly why you feel you are valued at this level. Going into the interview and preparing for questions is great and very important, but being able to advocate for yourself is just as important.
Yeah, I think you have both covered it nicely. Very simply from my side, we all go to work to be paid at the end of the day as well, and they are getting a salary. So do not be afraid to have that conversation up front. But as we've said throughout, be prepared for the questions to come back with and to really kind of describe your market value.
Thanks again to both of you. I think some great final comments there. Always a pleasure. And thanks to everyone for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please go back and check out episode 1 and 2 and make sure you like and subscribe as to not miss out on episode 4, which will be coming very soon. As always, we welcome your feedback and ideas for future topics. Please reach out, get in touch, comment below. Until next time, this has been the Right Ingredients Podcast. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Take care, everyone.